And I'll just make a note is that this will be recorded to be placed on the WAPA YouTube channel for viewing at later and any members who are not able to be with us this evening. So just want to make a note for everyone about that.
Okay, so let me ask, are y'all seeing my slides now? Is it good? Okay. So very good. I'm going to just jump in then. So thanks again. My name is Brian Smithson. I use he, him pronouns. I am a white male with a short brown beard and short brown hair, brown glasses, a tan jacket, and a blue button-down shirt. I'm in my office. You can see the window over my left shoulder and a filing cabinet over the other. Just a word of warning that the fire alarm keeps going off. So I've talked to the public safety people. They say there's nothing to worry about, but I hope you don't pick that up if that continues to happen. The title of my talk is From Collaborator to Star, Ethnographic Fieldwork and Celebrity Labor in West African Digital Filmmaking. And this is a work in progress. So this is a journal article, hopefully. It comes out of my field research that I did for my dissertation. I don't have any particular content warnings. The image that I'm starting with here is of basically my first encounter with Beninese filmmaking as it happened. I'm on the right side, sort of towards the middle of the image in a red t-shirt and a blue ball cap. And to the left, I'm speaking to a man in a brown buba, which is kind of a flowing African garment. He's got an admiral's cap on, and he's leaning on a maroon sedan. Towards the back, you can see some palm fronds, palm trees, a dirt path going off, and some filmmakers in the foreground have boom mics and a camera and are watching this scene unfold. So this was my introduction to CAPADI. This is an organization that it's a French acronym that, when translated, stands for the Collective of Innovative Dramatic Arts Professional Associations. And I had been introduced, basically, I'd been talking with a filmmaker just kind of informally, and he said, hey, there's a film being made right now. Do you want to see it? I was like, okay, yeah, of course. So we jumped on the back of his motorcycle. He brought me to this scene, and I greeted the guy you see in the brown buba. His name is Abiodun Oyede Romain. And I greeted him in Yorùbá. So he was like, whoa, hold on, this white guy speaks Yorùbá. You're going to be in the movie. So he came up with this scene on the spot. This was an improvised scene. Basically, what's going on at this point is this character of the film whom he's playing is called the General of Comedy, Le Général de la Comédie. It's a French language film. And his character is looking for death. He's literally trying to find a figure that represents death. And so he asks me, this white guy, this white tourist, where can I find death? And this was his joke. He wanted me to say in Iraq, because the Iraq war was fresh on people's minds. And so this was my introduction into this filmmaking scene, but it was also the first sort of step towards what would eventually become a form of stardom. And I'm using that word in scare quotes, but that's kind of where the title of my talk is coming from. So this is work that I'm thinking through now about what is the role of stardom in this filmmaking industry. And how is it that being a collaborator with these filmmakers thrust me into a system that is made to create stars in the local Beninese scene, when that was never my intention as an anthropologist. So in other words, I'm arguing here that despite our best efforts as anthropologists, we opened these new opportunities for people to make commentary on what we as outsiders represent to them. We usually think about fieldwork as this thing where we're learning about what's going on in the field, but it's also an opportunity for people to speak back through us as that symbol. And so that's what I'll be speaking about. My fieldwork was in Benin from about 2012 to 2016, 2 years of sustained fieldwork and a few different visits here and there. And I was really looking at what was it about Nàgó Yorùbá, that's the name of the ethnic group, Yorùbá, what was it about their filmmaking that was allowing them to basically speak back to other forces that were going on, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in a moment. And so what I'm arguing really is how that there is what I discovered through my participation was that there's a powerful model for basically allowing these films to be made, creating stars, but sustaining everything without a whole lot of cash, without a whole lot of wealth in wealth in money. Instead, it's a wealth and people kind of system, and I'll speak more about what I mean by that. But then coming in as this white American, as a collaborator, as a sort of member of this collective, introduced new wrinkles and allowed both of us, them and me, to do this kind of racial improv that I'll be speaking about. So let me jump to, if I can get my slides to move. Okay, a roadmap of where I'd like to go. I want to speak about ethnographic fieldwork as montage first and introduce this term, what I mean by montage. It's a fancy term that means editing, but I'm using it in a slightly different way here. Then I want to talk about movie aesthetics and how these movies get made and the labor regime that enables that kind of thing to happen. Then I'll jump into a comedy because a lot of these Yoruba filmmakers were comedians and they focused on humor as a big part of what they do. So then finally, I'll kind of think about ethnography as itself, a form of montage, and then I will give a summary and give some suggestions of kind of where I'm hoping to take this. All right, so the map that is on the screen now shows this region of West Africa with Benin in red, the country in red there. And so this is where I was focused for my field work. And the little green arrow is pointing to Pobe, the town where I was primarily based for the 2 years of extended field work that I did. I was really close to the border with Nigeria. And the reasons I was interested in this area are the same reasons why anthropologists have been looking at this area for at least almost a century. Melville J. Herskovits and Francis S. Herskovits did field work here in the 1930s, for example. And what interests people is that Benin historically was a major port in the transatlantic slave trade. It was a major part of that system that created the African diaspora, that created spread African and African-inspired religions across the Atlantic Ocean, across the North and South American continents and the Caribbean. So this has drawn a lot of attention by historians and anthropologists over the years. My own focus was really looking at that divide that was created by the colonial conquest of Africa when the Nigerian side and the sort of with Britain, the sort of Nigerian Great Britain side and the French Beninese side were divided. At the time, it was called Dahomey. The Benin side was called Dahomey, and the Yoruba ethnic group, this very large, robust group of folks, was split in two, with most of them in Nigeria. So I am a visual artist, so I wanted to see kind of what was going on with the art side of what Beninese film, especially film, what filmmakers were doing in Benin within a context of West African filmmaking that I'll go into a little bit more in a couple of slides here. So this image shows the platonic ideal of what I thought my fieldwork would look like. This, when I envisioned the project, writing my grants, this is what I thought was going to happen. I am on the far left there in a straw hat and a purple button-down shirt against an orange stucco wall. And then in the foreground, there is a man in a yellow shirt. This is Oladele Pedro, who goes by Lala. He's a cameraman, so he's operating a video camera. Some of his apprentices stand behind him. You can just kind of make out my wife right behind him as well. And then some toddlers are playing hide and seek in among our feet there. But with this slide, I want to zoom in on kind of what it was I was hoping to understand, why I wanted to be in those positions, observing these films being made. There's been a huge upsurge in digital media and media, sort of native-born disc-based media in West Africa since the 1990s. And I wanted to focus on how the Beninese were part of that movement. And this is an image of a shop in Benin, and there's posters on the left there that it's a guy in sort of Muslim attire. It says soul. So this is a representation of how a lot of this media that's coming out in this grassroots fluorescence is overtly religious in nature and focuses on the two major world religions in the area, Islam and Christianity. Kind of towards the bottom, you can see a couple of examples of some gospel albums that are more on the sort of Christian side of that. So this was interesting because in this part of the world, the Yorùbá, the Nàgó and the Yorùbá have a reputation for religious tolerance. So I was curious to see how they were able to resist, or how they were participating in what was becoming more religious strife in other parts of the region, especially in Nigeria. This is, and of course, the strife has been fueled by this growing access to media production technologies since the 1990s, especially when structural adjustment programs and those sorts of things opened up these markets to foreign investment, but also brought in a lot of cheap goods, things that like inexpensive camcorders and things like that that people could use to make movies. So the biggest, just a question, can y'all see this, or are you seeing my like little floating heads too? You're not seeing my floating heads? Okay. So I want to make sure it wasn't covering up the slide. So this slide has a comparison side by side of Nigeria's digital film industry and Benin's around 2018, when my fieldwork was kind of wrapping up. So the Nigeria side, the film industry there is known colloquially as Nollywood, and it's now one of the top three by number of films made, one of the top three film industries in the world after the United States and India. So these numbers give you a sense of how much money Nollywood brings in, how many movies are made, that kind of thing. They have to be taken with a grain of salt. There's no sort of central authority that keeps track of when movies are coming out. But compared to Benin, it's a bigger number. Although 300 for Benin versus 1,000 for Nigeria is pretty good comparing based on population size. But this just gives you an idea of how access to inexpensive production technologies like camcorders, for example, has enabled these films to be made at such a rapid clip, when before this was not the case at all for Africa. So in this image, we are comparing side by side another film set. This is showing how this is a film called Kemi, and there's a crane, there's a camera on a crane that's really high on the left side, and then on the right side, you can see that crane having been lowered down to kind of create this dolly shot going from top to bottom. This is just an example of the innovation that I noticed that I saw the filmmakers using. This is a crane that was created by a local metallurgist, and this was not something that was purchased or anything like that. It was created by hand and to do these kinds of shots. And this gives you an idea of the kind of innovation that the Beninese filmmakers are using. And another one of their innovations is that they've come up with a mutual aid society, the Kapadi, the organization that I mentioned at the top of my talk here. This was founded in 2003 as an advocacy organization, as a way to get these filmmakers on the same page and help them collaborate to grow the industry. And that's what it's been doing. And that's also the organization that agreed to collaborate with me when I went to the field. Excuse me. So I returned to this image of me when I first encountered Oyede, when I was told to play this tourist character in the film. And I want to just say that when I showed up, people were not expecting, or people agreed to allow me to collaborate. They were like, yeah, that's great, let's collaborate. But we didn't quite have a sense of what that was going to look like when I was, going back and sort of writing up grants and that kind of thing. How would it work, in other words, when I came back in 2014 to do that long-term field work? And so this is where I want to give a little bit of some sort of theoretical background on how I'm thinking about this now as montage. And again, this is a term that has a very practical meaning that comes out of filmmaking, and it literally means editing together discrete shots that create a cohesive film. A movie is made up of a bunch of different shots that then you edit them all together, and that creates the narrative. But there are also a lot of theorists in the humanities who have used this term, borrowed it, to indicate juxtaposing two or more concepts to allow for new ways of understanding what they mean in relationship to one another, or what their collective significance might be. And so here I'm drawing from philosopher Jacques Rancière and anthropology critic James Clifford. And these are scholars who have really tried to understand anthropology as part of this project as well. So Clifford, for example, talks about things like that are in this image here. These are three statues that depict different Fon divinities. The Fon are the ethnic group just west of the Yorùbá. And so these were statues that were plundered by the colonial French government, basically, and brought to France. They were placed in the Trocadero Museum for many years and then made their way to the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris. And they were recently repatriated. So that's a happy story. But Clifford wants to read this kind of collection of stuff. It's in its own right, it was bad because it was plunder, but it did sort of become, for the people that were working in these museums, like Marcel Mauss and people like him, became a way to sort of understand anthropology as those juxtapositions. These images or these statues, Clifford tells us, were like kind of placed willy-nilly. There wasn't a whole lot of organization. And so it was very much the ground zero of making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. So what I'm saying, I'm going to return to this image. This is Oyede and myself on that same day when I filmed that scene, the tourist scene with him. But this is a close-up on the two of us. I'm on the right side, he's on the left. We're looking at each other, kind of pondering, looking at each other, kind of thinking or whatever. This was, he asked to take this photo. He used my camera to do so because he thought it would be good for the promotional part of the film. And so this was an example of how I'm kind of using these ideas of montage a little bit differently. For Clifford, for Rancière, it's about data. It's about this kind of data and this kind of data coming into conflict. But I'm arguing that it's also about the social roles that we play when we're in the field, the anthropologist and the collaborators, the folks that we're supposedly working with, studying with, etc., thinking with. So field work itself is a form of montage. And this image also kind of signals the ways in which that montage was being triggered by my presence, and how I have kind of come to terms with needing to embrace my own sort of role within the filmmaking organization. It jolted new ideas into view for the folks in Benin, ideas about difference that I represented, differences of race, differences of nationality, when before there had been a system in place to kind of keep in check differences of religion and ethnicity, perhaps. So I'll speak a little bit about that next as I move to this roadmap slide again. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the films themselves use montage to create that star system, and then I'll bring it into sort of how they also use it to promote unity as opposed to division. So this is another image of Oyede in his outfit as a général. Same day, he also asked me to take this photo of him as in close up. You can kind of get a better sense of the character here. The admiral's cap, he's kind of got that dumbfounded stare. He's whitened his goatee with correctional fluid to make himself look more aged and wise, even though it's sort of a comic juxtaposition with his more bumbling demeanor. He's actually darkened his face with coal. It's hard to tell in this image, but he's done that. And let me give you a little bit of background on him. Oyede, sadly, he died in 2016, very shortly after I returned from the field. But before his death, he was the most famous comedian or the most famous filmmaker in Benin in this sort of more localized system that I'm describing. He created this character, Le Général de la Comédie, the General of Comedy, because he said he was like a military officer who makes you laugh. He was somebody who's achieved the highest ranks of comedy and wants to spread that joy to people. Oyede himself studied in Nigeria. He started as a stage producer or a stage comedian, and then he moved into film as film came on the scene. So aesthetically, his films kind of resemble the Nigerian films, but I don't think it's imitation. So that's where I'm going to go next and explain a little bit why it's not an imitation. It's actually doing some work the way he's making his movies. So now with this image, we're in Oyede's, what he called his shop. And it looked like a kind of a hut-like structure. It had rattan walls, a thatched roof, some benches in the back. You can see in the shadows there with some people sitting on them. Oyede liked to sit at this bench in the front and just hold court. People would come and go, and he would entertain them. He would make people laugh. He produced 4 comedies over the course of his career, and they were really popular. And he would travel very extensively on his motorcycle up and down the length of Benin, selling these films by hand with on disc. So this is, in contrast, this is a different kind of model from the art films. If anybody's taken an African art film class, usually, or an African film class, it's usually focusing on the art films. These are very much entertainment films. They have a goal to spread a moral message, perhaps, but they're not intended to, they don't necessarily fit into that mold that we usually think about film in through the Western scholarship lens. So this is the poster from Ma Vue. This is another view of his shop. You can see the posters for Ma Vue, which means my vision or my view, hanging from strings. And these images are, these posters kind of were part of that process of sort of getting people's names out there, getting people known to a broader audience. And let me see, I'm trying to make sure I'm not skipping a slide. Let me just back up one. Yeah, so what's sort of been revealed as I was doing this work, what was revealed to me anyway, was that these films, like, they're not as expensive as some of the art films are, but they're still very expensive for somebody locally. It costs between 2 to 5 million francs CFA, which is the Beninese currency, which is about $3,000 to $7,000 in US money. And a lot of that money comes from having to pay for the technical experts, the people that are going to run the camera, the people who are going to do the editing together, and so on. But the actors, on the other hand, are not usually paid. So this was the big question of, like, why were people participating in this film industry when they were not getting any money? You would pay for their travel, you would pay for their lodging, you'd pay for their food, but you wouldn't give them any kind of compensation for their actual work, the labor that they were putting into the movie. And so that became a question for understanding why that's the case. So I'm showing here a film jacket this is the back of a film jacket for a film called Ikukuatura, or The Jar of Sacred Bliss. And there's a bunch of hexagons, and each one has a different person's face in it. So every one of these people is an actor in the film. So the fact that this is the jacket design says something about what people are participating for. You get your face in the film, you get that exposure, you get some, the local filmmaker who invited you has more celebrity in their home market, so you're gaining more exposure in their market. But then by that same token, they're getting exposure in your home market if somebody sees this film on the shelf and they're like, oh, I know that person, right? So there's this exchange happening, but it's all focused on stardom. With the local word for the biggest performers is star, that they use the English word here. And so I want to focus on how that's affecting the aesthetic of the film itself. So this is a clip from the film Ikukuatura, and this is, or The Jar of Sacred Bliss. The film came out in 2016, and here we are going to see basically Oyede's character, the guy in the purple outfit on the far left of this still, he's playing a pastor, a Christian pastor. The man in the middle is Aremu Mashukuri, and he is playing a Muslim imam. And then on the right, we have Aline Abike playing the wife of the pastor. The context here is that the teenage children of both couple, the couple and the imam, have disappeared to go off and do some research in a village, but they haven't told their parents about that. So I'm just going to play the first few minutes of this to kind of give you a sense of the aesthetic that I'm trying to elaborate upon. So let's cross our fingers here that the sound and everything will work.
Bẹ́ẹ̀ wọlé tó wíjá. Mo rò pé orí yín pèsè. Ọpọlọ orí yín ti dàrú bí. Ṣé èmi lẹ́yìn fi ń ṣe yẹ̀yẹ́ láti ìdárùn surfacing you tí ọmọ ẹ ti gbé ọmọ mi pamọ́ sínú ilé yìí tí o sì mọ̀ wípé ọmọ ìmọ́lẹ̀ ni tí ẹ wá gbé ọmọ ìmọ́lẹ̀ pamọ́ sínú òkùnkùn òkùnkùn kò sì lè borí rẹ̀ nígbà tí ogun bẹ́ sílẹ̀ ní Íjíbítì tí àwọn ọmọ ogun Fáráò wọ́n lé àwọn ọmọ Ísírẹ́lì wọ́n lé wọn títí wọnú òkun pupa Jésù mi ó ní kí Mósè sì gbé ọ̀pá rẹ̀ sókè ó sì na òkun pupa kọjá ẹ̀yin ìmọ̀ òkùnkùn Sátánì ẹ parẹ́ sínú òkun pupa òkùnkùn náà ló parẹ́ sí.
Allahu Akbar Allahu Akbar ó mà ṣe o asọ́mọ̀rúkọ lẹ́yìn méjì.
kí ló ń gbé bẹ́ẹ̀.
àwọn kan wọ́n rò wípé ẹni tí yẹ ẹ kú àbí tí bàbá ẹ kú òun lọ́mọ orúkọ ni. àfáà mi ṣe ádámà àná ló fi yé mi pé kì í ṣe bẹ́ẹ̀. ó ní lé sálẹ̀ yẹ ti mú náà sí kọ́dí máa ta wà nídùú balẹ̀ yẹ ti mú ènìmí wálé adábí.
kí ló ń kó wí.
àwọn bọ̀ ohun tí mo sọ mọ́kànjú ó bọ̀. bàbá mi jẹ́ kó yé mi wípé ẹni tí bàbá ẹ bá kú tí ìyá ẹ bá kú kọ́ lọ́mọ òrukàn. bí bá ẹ ṣe ẹni tí ó pàdánù ìmọ̀ tó sì pàdánù ẹ̀kọ́.
All right, I'm reluctantly going to stop it there just to kind of keep to time. But I am on this slide showing a representation of the shot structure that was present in that clip, and I'll return to the religious, messages thing that's going on there, the comic back and forth that's happening between the actors in a couple of minutes here. But we start with, on the upper left here, a wide shot. You can see everybody in the scene. This is setting the stage. It's called an establishing shot. In the middle, we move down to close up on Oyede as the pastor, as he delivers his lines about the Red Sea and Moses and disappearing and that kind of thing. Then the camera swaps to a view of the imam giving his rebuttal. Of course, while Oyede is delivering his part, that we're kind of flashing back and forth a little bit. But this is a very common film pattern that you can see in most anything you watch these days. It's called shot, reverse shot. And it's just these intersecting close-ups that create this illusion of a conversation. There are other little things that kind of help enhance that. You can, in the second image, you can see the corner of the imam. In the corner, you can see the back of the imam's head, basically. And so that reinforces that he's still being talked to. And the gazes of the two actors are looking at one another and not at the camera itself. So that creates this illusion that they're looking at one another. What's not so clear is that this is it's actually a pretty complicated and time-consuming shot structure to obtain. So I'm going to zoom now to a shot of, or a photograph of a film set back a little bit further. And you will, here we have Oyede. He's kind of obscured by a lighting technician, but there's some lights, there's some actors in the extreme background, and then myself sitting, watching in the back in the darkness. But when you're on a film set like this, there's getting those shot counter shot, getting that pattern takes at least twice as long or 3 times as long as it would to do it the way that it was done in the early days of Nollywood and these kinds of African films. The earlier films, the Nollywood films that came out in the early, like late 80s, early 90s, they often followed almost like they were recording a stage play. So everything was just shot in one shot. There was no camera work whatsoever. But now if you want to do this kind of a shot, you've got to record one actor doing all of their lines, then you've got to switch to the second actor doing all of their lines. And if there's a third, then you do it again, and then you do it again in wide shot, possibly also in a medium shot. And it's expensive. It takes a lot of time, and people complained about it to me. They're like, we have to do this structure, but it takes more time. We would be done so much faster, and the films would be so much cheaper. But they're still doing it. So rather than just saying it was some sort of like mimicry of Nigerians' current practice, I wanted to know, like, why? What's the upshot? Why do it this way? And it's because of the close-ups. It's the close-ups bringing that recognition to the people. People recognize your face if you're in that close-up, on the poster, in the credits, etc. So as I move to this blank slide, I'll speak just a little bit about wealth and people and why I think that that's an important piece of this puzzle. So there are various scholars of African social systems that have talked about a patron-client system of as being an important one in a lot of African contexts. This is Jean-François Bayard, this is Karen Barber, this is Jane Geyer. And Barber specifically writes about the Yorùbá in Nigeria and how there's a patron-client system where a patron pulls strings for a bunch of people that are considered, in her terms, clients. And then the clients in return are carrying out tasks for the patron and represent in aggregate that patron's social capital. The patron has access to all these people that are willing to do, little tasks for them on the ground. So I'm going to move to an image of Oyede here on the far left, wearing an agbado. It's like a very flowing garment that's associated with Yorùbá, socially superior Yorùbá men, or people that have reached a high social status. And so Oyede is here talking to two other actors, a couple of women that are seated in front of a sort of a gray building. So if you're the biggest star in the area, as he was, you can call up the biggest network of clients to work for you on your films. And you can call up technical crew to work for you for cheaper. You can call up a bunch of different people that want to be famous, that want to have their names out there to work on your film for you. And you can avoid the problem that I saw with some filmmakers where maybe a lower ranked filmmaker convinced a higher ranked one to be in a film, but then that higher ranked one got annoyed or something and kind of left, and then it leaves the lower ranked filmmaker high and dry. So it's a good system, but it is still prone to egos and to schism if people disagree in those kinds of situations I'm talking about. How did the filmmakers try to avoid that situation? So that's what I'll move to the next move back to my roadmap and talk a little bit about that spirit of comedy that I think is really key to what they're doing, how they're maintaining that cohesion, and how that ties in with this patron-client system. So I'm going to return to a still of that scene from Ikoko Atura where the pastor and the imam are having this exchange. Again, they're fighting over the fact that their children have left and the pastor thinks that they're being holed up in this imam's house because the two children are dating, basically. On set, this whole exchange, the back and forth, the fighting, all of these like very, very elaborate insults and biblical references and the Muslim chanting, this was all improvised. So this is a common practice in these films, is that they'll have a basic scenario down, but there's not dialogue written down. The actors come up with that on their own. And even though these insults get pretty hairy, and especially I didn't show the whole clip, but they get even more hairy towards the end there. Every time Beninese audiences see this, it brings out laughter. This is a really funny scene. And on set too, everybody was just in stitches. It got more and more offensive, literally, with every take that we did. Like I said, you film one guy, then you film the other, then you film, so they kept playing on each other, building up into this boisterous takedown of one another based on religion. And the two stars here, these are both high-level comedians, Manshukuri and Oyede, and they're playing their own religion here. So Oyede is really Christian, Manshukuri is really Muslim. And there is really Muslim-Christian strife in Nigeria, in Benin, in places nearby. So what's going on here, I'm arguing, is that they're using this offensive humor to basically downplay the religious difference rather than stoke each other up. They're downplaying religious difference so that they can stress what they have in common, which is their Nàgó Yorùbá religious identity. They're valorizing their tradition, and they even put it in those terms. They use the term tradition, which I'll define here in a moment, and see this comic impulse coming from indigenous Nàgó Yorùbá religious comic sensibilities. So with this slide gives the definition of what my interlocutors, what my collaborators meant by that word tradition. Basically, they use the term in French, tradition, to mean things considered African by origin or by common use, rather than white or foreign. The other term that they would use, the sort of Yorùbá word, or pair of words that means the same thing, is asha ibile, which means the culture of the land, literally translated. And so this is a category that includes things like customs, morality, an ontological understanding of the world, and a set of resources that people understand they can tap into for when they're feeling stressed, when they're in times of trouble, that kind of thing. So I'm now on an image here of the Gelede masquerade. It's a very famous masquerade from West Africa, the Yorùbá people, especially in Benin. And the Gelede here are dancing in front of the central mosque of Pobe, where I was doing my field research, with a large crowd behind them. So these colorful masks were literally cited by Oyede as the inspiration for his comic sensibilities. His father was a member of the Gelede troupe nearby where his shop was located, and it's a group that their dances are intended to honor these powerful divinities known as the mothers, Awon Iyawa in Yoruba. So these are powerful female divinities, and there's been a lot of really good art historical and anthropological attention to them from people like Babatunde Lawal, Margaret and Henry Druel. But one of the part that I want to focus on is how the Gelede use comedy, specifically comic insults called efe in Yoruba, to draw attention to immoral behavior, to target those they want to bring down, who have maybe gotten a little too highfalutin, or to call out immoral activity among people in the audience, people in the community. And so through these songs, they shame the folks that are doing this behavior, but they also send a warning out to the audience, you know, that this kind of behavior is supposed to be downplayed, is not really desirable. And there's even a version of this called an ikbe, which is a curse. And this is what why Oyede said he himself was not a member of Gelede. He said that his father told him that their ikbe were so powerful that they could curse a tree and the tree would wither and die. So his father told him, you know, if you want to sing and perform and be a comedian, do it for God or do it for Nàgó Yorùbá culture, but don't necessarily be a member of the Gelede. Even with that said, though, Oyede really felt a strong connection to this background. And so he drew upon it for that kind of comic license to do what I'm describing within the filmmaking community. And this is another area where I can talk more about, you know, theoretical ideas of comedy and the carnivalesque and all that kind of stuff if people are interested in the Q&A. But this direct connection is the important point here that he saw from Gelede to what he's doing as a comedian in the films. So I'm actually not going to show this clip because I think I don't have enough time, but I will describe what the point was here. So this is a clip from, or a scene from a film called Ma Vue. It's the follow-up, My View. It's the follow-up to the one that I was in earlier as the tourist. And in this movie, the general character that Oyede plays is struck blind because one of his employees, his chauffeur, is mad at him. Basically, the chauffeur cheated with the guy's wife, and so he got fired. And then the chauffeur goes to a babalawo, a kind of diviner, to curse his master. And so babalawo aren't supposed to do that. So it's all kind of, he's a crooked babalawo, but he does it. He curses the general character. He gets blinded. And in this scene, he's called in a Christian pastor to heal him of that blindness. And so we witness the miracle. And then the priest here is played by Jean-Marie Ogu. We witness that miracle and everybody cheers. So like I said, I'm going to skip it just for the interest of time. But in this still from the set, this is that scene being filmed. We have the three characters, the general, his wife, and the priest, all cheering this miracle. But what we don't see in the film, basically, the general gets healed, and then he gives some money to the priest, and the priest accepts it. It's a small gesture, but it kind of implies that the priest is a little shady too, perhaps. That little joke, what it resulted from, basically, the original time it was filmed, the general offers to give the money, and he says no. But then two below the line people, a cameraman and somebody who was playing a minor role, kind of yelled out, "No, that's a lie," and "No, he would take the money." And then everybody kind of laughed. They kind of started imitating Muslim prayer. The Christians started imitating Muslim prayer, and the Muslims started imitating a Catholic priest chanting. And so then Oyede said, yeah, let's reshoot it. So he put that into the movie. So it's an example of how that patron-client system also can be used to kind of keep the higher level folks in line. This was an example of those lower line people seeing this kind of religious toleration being challenged in a film because it was going to have this pro-Christian message. And then they called that out and requested that it be made to sort of level the playing field, and the Christian guy gets to seem like a little bit shady himself. So as I'm starting to move towards the end of the talk here, this final section here, I want to talk about, with my roadmap slide, ethnographic montage, that returned to my concept there, and how my presence kind of influenced my thinking on this, and how I'm thinking through the way that I was integrated itself. In this slide, we've got 4 images. The 2 on the left go together, and the 2 on the right go together from top to bottom. These are from the training that I eventually was allowed to be involved with. Oyede Pedro, Lala Pedro was a filmmaker apprentice himself, and he led a workshop for some of his lower ranked apprentices on how to make film, and so invited me to join in here. And so these are the images with photographs we took during that session. And it took a long time to get to this point though. And we have a shot counter shot on the left side that I've described earlier. And on the right side, we have a high angle view and a low angle view, kind of demonstrating that where you place your camera can give a different sensibility to the scene. And again, like I said, this was a hard place to get to, because when I first arrived in Benin, people assumed that I was some kind of film expert. There was an assumption that I was there to share my expertise on making movies along a more European style of making films. So in this image here, I'm on set again. I'm wearing a orange and yellow long sleeve shirt, and there's a camera filming me in the foreground, holding a book. But this is when I explained to people basically that I was not a film expert, that I was there to learn from them. It was that collaboration that we had kind of decided we would go along with back in 2012 or so. I'm showing up in 2013, 2014, and now they're trying to figure out what to do with me if I'm not a technical expert. And I never represented myself as one, but they had to figure out how to slot me in. And so the easiest place to do that was through the film acting, through these places like here, where I was being asked to portray a doctor. This is a medical doctor role. But why a doctor? Right? My roles were things like doctors and a tourist and those sorts of things. And this is something that I'm reflecting on now, and I think it's because my image was stoking these long-standing images of whiteness that had long been placed there by colonization, by the transatlantic slave trade, where the whites in this equation are the ones that have the wealth. They have access to this white technology, this Western technology. In Yorùbá, the term is oyinbo, which refers to a white person generally. And the film sector was no different, which is why, that people constantly would use development discourse, for example. They would say, we want to develop our film industry, and we want some help with that. So my collaboration, though, like I said, I was not a trained filmmaker, so my collaboration could not be on this technical level. It could be on the advocacy level back home, and it could be on this level of being an actor in the movies themselves. This is another sort of production still from a film called Kemi, and here, and I'm in the center there with a short sleeve button-down shirt and some khaki pants and my straw hat. Oyede's on the far right in another buba, as I described earlier. Then there's 3 other African men in this kind of clothing that's very characteristic of village lifestyle, this sort of like idealistic image of village lifestyle. So here I'm an investor. I've come in from the West to invest in a cocoa farm. And so how I'm thinking through this now is that my appearance sparked this kind of ethnographic improv in figuring out ways to incorporate me. And as Jane Geyer says in talking about patron-client relationships, not all clients are considered equal. So if I wasn't going to be the patron, because I'm not able to give this technical expertise, I was a different kind of client. And one of the things that I had to offer was the shock value of having a white guy on screen speaking Yorùbá, you know, doing these kinds of roles. So it eventually, from that point of me being improvisationally inserted into films where I had never been conceptually part of it, it led to people creating roles for me down, you know, and telling me about them, like this one here. This was a role that was created ahead of time. And then it led to even people trading access to me to their friends, which I was happy to give. But I would hear, you know, like, hey, I've got a friend in Nigeria. He's filming a movie. He needs somebody to play this foreign boyfriend character. And then I'll also be in the movie. Would you come with me? And, you know, I was like, of course, yeah, that sounds great. So I became part of this system in that I was able to help out in these ways. So let me move to the poster for Ecoquatura. This is the film that I ended up helping to produce eventually, and there's a URL at the bottom there if anybody wants to find this on YouTube and watch it. I've translated it into English. You'll see in the middle there towards the end of the title is my mug again in my hat, and that was one of the other ways that I became part of this system is my face on these posters as kind of that shock draw to the audience, like, whoa, there's a white guy in this one. And so this was an unintentional, or an unintended, I should say, an unintended ethnographic montage that was created. I was put into this star system and was never trying to be famous in any way, shape, or form. But then towards the end of my field work, my friends were joking, like I would walk around, people would shout out Ayokunle, which was my Yoruba stage name, basically, that it was given to me. And they would joke, like, you've become a star. And so I just kind of shrugged it off. But now I'm thinking through it now, you know, as I'm writing this up and thinking about how this was very similar to how people like Oyede were referred to as Le Général, as their main characters and kind of known by these identities. I guess the other part of this is that it opened me up to a similar visual critique as well. So I realize I'm late on time, so I'm not going to show this clip, but but this is me on the set of another one of those films, and here I'm playing a politician, right? And I have come in and I'm saying, like, hey, help me steal the 2016 election. And this Babalao guy is like, yeah, let me help you do that. So this is how my presence sort of opened up these conversations for Beninese filmmakers to step in and critique this whiteness as well, this concept of whiteness as somehow sacrosanct. This was calling it out as corrupt, right? So there were examples of this kind of thing. I'll skip that and just kind of start wrapping up here. Basically, as I move to this roadmap slide, what I'm thinking through now is, with this blank slide, is how to conceptualize my role in all of this, because I was kind of trained out of that putting yourself too much into the story sort of thing. Like we all have read writing culture. We know there was that big critique in the 80s, but because I was in an industry doing field work with people that themselves were creating images, I became part of the images they created. And I'm now forcing myself to theorize and conceptualize, like, what are the ramifications of that? And I think a big part of it is that I was sorted into their system of patron clientelism, but also used as a symbol of whiteness that they could then critique with me as that mediator there. Here's a list of some of my sources. I'm happy to share these slides or my rough transcript with anybody who wants to see them and kind of delve into these a little bit more in depth. And the same with my various places and people that have helped fund this research. I want to acknowledge them and say thank you. And with that, I will wrap up. Thank you very much. You can email me at bcsmithson@smcm.edu if anybody has questions that we don't get to tonight or wants to follow up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that incredible talk, an incredibly rich talk, and we all very much appreciate it. So please help me in thanking Dr. Smithson for being with us this evening. We are welcome to open the floor for questions. Absolutely, please feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself. You can also put questions in the chat, and I am happy to read them, whatever will work best for you all. So we can open up for some questions and discussion at this time.
Yes, and y'all please call me Brian.
I can start. I just had a question, maybe a bit of a backstory about the writing of the scripts. Who put those? You had said that this character for you was created. What was that like in terms of actually creating the scripts for the films? And
yeah, I mean, it was one of those things I was also really curious about, and the process, as I was able to see it, has basically two different forms. One is that people will kind of, if you're the producer and you're putting in the money for the film, it's often a showcase of you because you're the one that's outlaying all the money. So you're going to write the script yourself. Most people don't write a detailed line-by-line script. Instead, it'll say scene 1, character A and character B do this thing in the marketplace. Scene 2, it's just like just kind of a summary of what's going to happen. And then the actors are used to improvisation, so they will improv on the set and make it up on the spot. The other way that sometimes happens is a group of people will collaborate, if like a film club or something like that, or an acting troupe wants to make a film together. But it's still usually improv, and that kind of, I think that was a key reason why I was able to be integrated into the film so easily, is because they're so used to improvisation.
thank you so much for that clarification. Thank you. We have a question in the chat from Sheila. What did Oyede die from? And please correct me again if I'm mispronouncing that. What did he pass away from?
I never got the story on how he died. I just knew when I got back from the field, I was just informed by some friends that I had worked with that he had passed away, and so I was unable to go to his funeral rites and that kind of thing, but I was able to help put together a little memorial for him. But I honestly don't know. I didn't want to pry as people were going through a kind of a trying time. But yeah, it was very tragic. He was only maybe in his late 40s when he passed away, so he was very young.
Thank you for that. Other questions or discussion with Brian this evening? Yes, Bill, go right ahead.
Thanks. Thanks, Brian. Really interesting. And I was glad that your first answer to the question brought out, the importance, and almost as a day-to-day practice for many Africans everywhere, of improvisation, and innovation. And that's what really keeps it kind of authentic and real. So, the acting in many ways, I think you were focused on a lot on the aesthetics of, the production of the film and how that's evolved, and really more, complex, and there's a lot more art and all of that involved. But yet the acting itself, I think the idea of trying to keep it, authentic and really drawing on perhaps certain stereotypes also, in everything. And so, and you played some interesting ones. My question, though, is about on the distribution side. And I wonder if, and you may not have really had a chance to check into this, but I wonder if there's any connection between the stardom, being a star, and its impact on the distribution of the film afterwards. Through kin networks, friendship networks, the
No,
fact
absolutely, yeah. No, absolutely. And in the bigger version of this, I go into that. It is very much about stardom giving you access to any of those stars' networks. So it's in this patron cliental system. Those clients have their own patron cliental systems that they're in charge of, or whatever, or kinship networks, as you described, or just friendship networks. And like somebody like Oyede, I'll give his example. He was tireless with these movies. He would make the movies and then he would burn the discs himself because he didn't want to pay some Nigerian disc burn company to do it. He wanted to do it himself. He had a computer. He did it himself. He printed out the little label that goes on there and pasted them on meticulously, every single one himself. Then he would put them on the side, basically on a tiny little motorcycle, and his big frame, he would sit on the motorcycle and he would literally drive town to town to town to town to town with a megaphone announcing that he was coming. So there's a distribution of sort of like the showmanship of it. But then other folks who didn't have that kind of, I guess, work ethic or whatever you want to call it, or at least that sort of like moxie, were relying on their name recognition to sell these films. So you can count on selling it locally in your home community because people know you there. But then you also rely on any merchant friends you have or kin that live in other towns nearby. But the bigger piece of it is that sort of stardom of the other people. So if you've featured actor, some actor from a town 3 towns over, even if he only has a minor role, because he's on the back of that film jacket, you can sell the film in his hometown because people are going to know him. He's like a local celebrity there, even if his role is, like a walk-on like mine was. So yeah, it's definitely, to your question, very much an important part of the distribution since there is no centralized distribution network. I will, just as a slight caveat before I kind of wrap up my answer, cell phones and the internet, these sorts of things are becoming much more common. So that's changing things. While I was doing fieldwork about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, I guess, people were still, phones were sort of in their infancy as far as digital video watching devices. But I'm going back this summer and definitely want to see how the sort of streaming and that kind of thing has shifted things.
Right, it's okay. I'm going to combine a couple of the questions that are in the chat and just
Sure.
let you have time to answer. The first one, are these, and they kind of connect together a bit. Are these films shown only in the community, or are they shown throughout the country to other ethnic groups? That's the first question. The second is, any idea of the actual approximate number of film copies sold? And the third is, how common were white actors in these sorts of films in general?
Okay, excellent. And I'm glad to see Maya in the chat. Maya is one of my students, so thank you for coming, Maya. So yeah, so who watches these films? How widely do they circulate? It was a constant point of tension among the filmmakers when I was there because they have a vested interest in promoting Yorùbá language and Nàgó Yorùbá culture. But the lion's share of Yorùbá media comes out of Nigeria. So they're competing with this juggernaut that's making these films in Yorùbá, often with bigger budgets, and you're trying to make a film about Yorùbá-ness in your own home community. So some people would experiment with, it was mostly a linguistic question. So if you want your film to be more widely distributed, you could make it in French, but a lot of folks were morally opposed to that because it was basically capitulating to the colonial language. There was also a brief experimental period where people would have a scene and they would literally have somebody say, he's going to the palace. And then another character would say, yeah, he's going to the palace in Yorùbá. And then the third character would say, he's going to the palace in another language, Fon. And so the idea was like, hey, if we just like kind of embed those 3 languages into the film, but it became too cumbersome. But yeah, I mean, it kind of limits the distribution if you do your language, if you do it in the Nàgó Yorùbá language, it limits your distribution to basically Nàgó Yorùbá Bénin, Yorùbá speaking Bénin. And that was one of the big challenges that had never been kind of circumvented while I was there. The answer about how many are sold, a typical film, you'll probably burn about 1,000 copies if you're expecting it just to kind of sell locally. If you're a big name like Oyede, you could sell 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. Still, those numbers are relatively small if you consider the millions of people that see something like Barbie or Oppenheimer or whatever. But locally, that's pretty good. So that was always the gamble. You have to burn as many CDs or VCDs, video CDs, as you think you can sell. And so I had friends who were just kind of lamenting, like, nobody's buying my movie. I've got 700 extra copies, that kind of thing. So in a lot of ways, these are passion projects for people. And then I think Maya's question about how common were white actors, not at all. I was the only one as far as I know. Right when I arrived, there was a white guy who had come in from, I mean, he may have not even considered himself white. He was Brazilian, and he was there for religious reasons. So the more common reason people in Benin see white folks is because they come as religious tourists or just as tourists. But the religious tourists are folks who are like embracing African spirituality, and they want to come back to the so-called roots and embrace that. So at first, a lot of people thought I was doing that when I told them I wasn't a film expert. So yeah, the answer is I was the only one in the movies, basically.
Thank you so much for those responses. What sorts of advocacy have you been able to do in the US for the Benin film actors and producers?
Yeah, it's a great question. It continues to be a really important part of my pedagogy. So now I'm at St. Mary's and I have a stable position here. And I am teaching an African film class, for example. So a big part of what the filmmakers wanted me to do was to spread the word about their films to my spheres of influence, to American audiences. So one of those ways that I do that is through my teaching, but like literally through assignments where I'm asking students to seek out African films that are maybe not ones that they would otherwise watch, to embrace them, look at them, watch them, find what they can that they think is sort of really cool about them. Just kind of encourage that kind of connoisseurship and spectatorship among my students, especially, and friends and family if I can. But I also just sort of on a more practical level, when I was in Benin especially, and when I'm interacting with folks that I know from the sort of American political sphere, I am trying to promote more support for filmmaking in places like Benin. The US Embassy, when I was there, they ran a film showcase, for example. It was called Atelier Film Showcase. And it was a program where they were inviting West African film. It was like a worldwide program, but Benin was selected as one of the countries. And they invited filmmakers to come and get some training from American filmmakers. And it was like a sort of a cultural exchange. So I really worked with a lot of the filmmakers I worked with to get them as part of that program, for example. So yeah, any way I can to sort of use my access, I do it.
Great. Quick question before I go to the two questions that maybe have a little bit more in depth. Would it be possible to see the slide again with the film's name? There's been a question, what is the film called and how is it spelled?
So which movie are we talking about? The one that I said was on YouTube, or the one, because there was, I could type them into the chat.
Yes, that would be wonderful. Maybe that it doesn't specify, but that would be great. Thank you so much.
So there was Ma Vue, there was Ikokwatura, and then was there another one? I think those were the two that I talked mostly about.
That's great. Thank you so much for that.
Ikokwatura is the one that you can find on YouTube.
Could you please discuss how patron-client relationships work towards equalizing relationships, i.e. your notion of friendly tensions between Christians and Muslims?
So it's not, so the patron-client relationship is a hierarchical one, so I'm not trying to imply that that's not the case, but it's built into the system that the patrons can kind of get everybody underneath them to do what they want within reason, but the clients still maintain a lot of power. So there's one of the points that Barbara makes in that piece. She talks about it as like there's this patron-cliental version of how hierarchy works in Yorùbá land, and that applies to the divinities as well. So she talks about how like if you're following divinity like Ogun, the god of iron, and you petition Ogun for help in a particular area, and Ogun doesn't give you that help, people would be like, okay, well, forget about you, and they'll go to the next divinity. So there's not just one patron, there's multiple you can choose from. So there's always sort of that lateral movement among the clients. And what I was trying to illustrate with that scene that I kind of had to rush through with the pastor accepting a bribe from the guy he just healed, that was in response to some of the clients saying like, hey, they were calling out Oyede for making a film that was too pro-Christian. And so my reading of that and those sorts of incidents is that Kapadi wants to maintain that religious tolerance, and the way that they do that is through these kinds of insults of one another. But it can happen from the base up to the patrons, and it can happen from the patrons down to the base. They kind of keep each other in line that way. And I can say more about that if that didn't answer the question.
Thank you very much. So I'll combine it seems like the last two questions in the chat. Please feel free. I know we'll have a few more minutes, maybe if we have some additional questions. what fields do actors work in to earn a living? And then the second question is, do you or the people you were with there enter their films in film festivals?
Excellent questions. Let me jot this down so I can remember. Okay. So the question about how they earn a living is really an important one. And a lot of it is so basically acting is seen as a profession on par with other things like that are part of being in an urban space. And so I'm again drawing from Barber here, and she writes about how Yoruba film or stage actors were providing humor and services to the growing class of people that were allowing the colonial cities to basically exist. So these are people that were being trained as electricians and plumbers and sign painters and car mechanics and that kind of thing. And the Yoruba filmmakers I worked with, most of them had jobs in those fields. So Oyede was a sign painter on the side, so he kind of supplemented his income there. I knew a lot of folks that were things like electricians and plumbers and carpenters. So they're the people, they haven't gone to school beyond maybe high school, so they don't have like a university degree. A lot of them didn't finish high school, and so they get into these skilled trades. But that just helps with that DIY atmosphere that Bill Roberts mentioned earlier, that DIY, they're able to make it work, that crane that I showed you, like these things. So I talk a little bit more about that in the book project, about how these so-called mundane professions really influence the way that they get this stuff done. And then as far as the film festivals piece, there's two sides to that. So traditionally, these film festivals have been a showcase for art film that's funded largely by European institutions, and they do it as a form of soft power. They'll give money to an African filmmaker, and that filmmaker will make movies or make a film, and then do it along a sort of more European style aesthetic. So the films that I'm talking about, they don't stand a chance in those kinds of film festivals because the art is supposed to look more European in style. It's not supposed to look like these Hollywood films do. So one thing that a lot of the filmmakers did, the year before I got there, unfortunately, I didn't get to see it. They staged their own film festival. They had a film festival for all of the movies that had been made in Yoruba that year. And they picked things like Best Actor and Best Actress and Best, like sort of a mini Oscars sort of thing. And they had always dreamed of doing another one, but they just could never get the funding. But there is movement. They acknowledge the role of these kinds of awards, and we're really, really hopeful to be able to do that. And then finally, one other filmmaker, a guy named Jacob Abiodun, was trying to square that circle. He was using the system that I'm talking about, but he was trying to emulate a more sort of European aesthetic, and he's entered his films into a few film festivals. He's trying to bridge that divide, but currently it's still mostly a divide.
Thank you so much. I think we have all the questions answered in the chat. Are there any additional questions or comments before we wrap up? I know I have learned a great deal and want to thank you again for being with us this evening. I hope we can all thank Brian one more time for being with us. Thank you for sharing your work with WAPA. It was truly a delight to have you with us as part of our speaker series.
Well, thank y'all. Yeah, this has been a joy. So I really appreciate the invitation and giving me the opportunity to talk through some of this stuff. So I hope we can, if anybody has further comments, please reach out, because I need to think through more of this. So it's been great to do that.
Yes, we will make sure that the recording is posted, and happy to post directions as to how to access it through the WAPA website.
Excellent.
And also, for our next event will be in February, and this is when we have the National Association for the Practice, Bill, help me with the acronym, NAPA, National Association for Practicing Anthropology, or
Practicing Anthropology, yeah.
Practicing Anthropology. It's practice or practicing. When we have National Association for Practicing Anthropology, with one of our members, will be sharing updates to their most recent initiatives around work and publication and such. So please keep a lookout for those event details, because they will be coming and sharing some of those new guidelines with us in February. So thank you again. Thank you for being with us, and wishing you all the best as you continue to think through and write, and really looking forward to reading and hearing more about your work. And thank you to everyone for being with us this evening very much. Thank you again, and take care.
Thank y'all.
Have a great
Good night.
evening. Thank you.
Bye-bye.